The theme of the session is Mario Mignone and Italian cultural history. And the first presenter will be Ernesto Ialongo. Ernest is professor of history at Hostos Community College in the City University of New York. He's the author of Filippo Tommaso Marinetti, The Artist and His Politics, 2015, and articles dealing with modern Italian politics and culture, including nation building through anti-Semitism in Annali d'Italianistica, 2018, Filippo Tommaso Marinetti and Fascist Italy's Racial Turn in Visual History, Rivista Internazionale di Storia e Critica dell'Immagine, 2018, and Visualizing Italy Through a Militant Lens, F.T. Marinetti and Italy's Military Experience in Italy and Military Cultures, 2020. The title of his paper is Mario Mignone as Historian. Ernest.
I had the good fortune of having worked with Mario Mignone on a couple of occasions. In 2009, is this going to work? Well, let's try it this way. In 2009, I had just finished my dissertation on Filippo Marinetti and his politics. It was the 100-year anniversary of the founding of the Future Start movement, and the center had a conference at its Florence campus. And I went there and I presented my work. A few years later, when I published my book, Mario invited me out here to present the book, and I very much enjoyed the occasion to talk with a number of literary scholars of futurism about futurist politics. There was some disagreement, but keeping with Stefano Vaccaro, where is he? There he is. Mario very much enjoyed having different points of views on the table, and then you make up your own mind. Today, to continue the intellectual journey with Mario Mignone, I want to look at some of the themes that he explored in his more historical work, specifically his volume, Italy Today. I'll be speaking on the third edition, 2008, and my colleague here, Nicolino Applauso, will be thankfully talking about the fourth edition in press. The book has become a standard reference work for anyone seeking a primer on post-war Italy. And to give proper context to Italy since World War II and after the fall of the Soviet Union, Mignone offers the general reader broad and eloquent summaries of the main currents of Italian history from the Risorgimento onwards. Often, his comments are incredibly prescient. I want to share with you some of the themes of the book that Mignone touches on, and in the process show how he introduced so many readers to Italy and its history. In this book, Mignone very consciously placed himself in opposition to that view of Italy as having been a failure as a nation with a weak national identity. Arguing against an older Anglo-Saxon version of Italian history, Mignone accepted Italy for what it was. Quote, in the process of questioning old cliches, the fundamental issue of what Italy is as a nation is raised. Is it a social fiction with no fixed identity? Does the fact that a strong civic consciousness and a developed sense of the nation state, said to be found in the mature democracies, are held to be lacking in Italy, where familism and local identities allegedly hold sway? Does that justify the view that such Italian peculiarities must be pathological abnormalities? His answer in this book is a resounding no. When referring to the linguistic diversity of the country and its varied dialects, as well as Italians who were of French, Albanian, Slovene, German, and Greek descent, he argued, quote, the linguistic diversity of the peninsula and islands, so often interpreted as a sign of weak national culture, is actually the basis of a rich cultural pluralism. Additionally, a national identity defined by cultural plurality is rooted in Italy's place in the Mediterranean. And as such, I commend Alessandro for his paper earlier. Quote, while remaining firmly anchored in the world of Western European civilization, Mignone wrote, Italy seems to stretch out naturally toward the opposite shore of the Mediterranean. Thus, Italy can be considered to be the most natural link between Europe and the peoples of Africa and Asia, bordering as they do on the same sea and sharing over many centuries both historical events and cultural influences. With these words, Mignone firmly placed himself in alliance with scholars of Mediterranean studies, who look to just these international connections to define national identity and do not simply look to internal cultures. He comes to his conclusions, Mignone, by looking at Italy from an Italian perspective, and not, as he wrote, from the American or Western European one. Mignone was born and raised in Italy, but spent most of his life in America and returned to Italy frequently, as many of us do in this audience, to do research and to visit family and friends. As such, Mignone offered us a vision of Italy that did not begin from the premise of it not meeting a pre-established Western standard, but that appreciated Italy on its own merits, though pointing out where Italy was in need of reform. In writing this book, Mignone was also talking to Americans, and Italian Americans specifically, and seeking to correct images of Italy which did not match the current nation. Somehow, he wrote, the American view of Italy is still affected by the memories of Italian Americans whose forefathers had left crushing poverty for a land of opportunity. And although their sons and daughters are corporate heads, sit in Congress and on the Supreme Court, have risen to the top of many professions, and have been economically successful, their success has not completely erased the stereotypes of their parents' place of origin as being a poor and underdeveloped country. This image has been reinforced by new situations, a country where the government often falls and is replaced by another with equally poor prospects, where strikes abound, and where people in the 1950s and 60s were still pouring out of the underdeveloped South to seek work in Northern European countries or across the ocean. And, of course, he continued, in reporting or portraying the persistence of the mafia and other forms of corruption within Italian political and social life, the American media perpetuates images of Italians that are in line with those portrayed in The Godfather and The Sopranos. In the face of these ideas, Mignone wanted to offer his readers a sense of what Italy actually was and how it got to be that way. When surveying Italy's post-unification history, Mignone effortlessly summarized the main trajectory of the story. He noted that, quote, contrary to the myths about the Risorgimento, this movement for Italy's resurgence was anything but a popular groundswell. It was Italy's failed revolution. Cavour united Italy under a government guided by aristocratic oligarchs who had a great fear of populism and no intention of sharing the national government with the masses. And as a nation unified under Northern rule, he added, it was clear that the South had been reluctantly accepted into the new state. The anti-brigand campaign army officers and the government understood their opponent predominantly by means of a series of hierarchical binary oppositions, such as between civilization and barbarism, reason and violence, social order and crime. These conceptions of the South as being constructed in opposition to the North, he noted, persists up to today in the debate of North versus South. This notion, of course, has not gone away. When dealing with the North-South divide, Mignone clearly connects the problems of Southern underdevelopment to the portrayal of the South as the barbaric, civilized other, quote unquote. He writes, at the superficial level of the kind of images evoked, one can find the same ethnocentric themes across a century of Italian history, connecting the depictions of the uncivilized South after unification and referring to the 1992 election and the emergence of Umberto Bossi's Northern League. Mignone made the connection explicit. The wastefulness and degeneration of the Italian state can be selectively blamed on the presence of Southern workers in state jobs and on public assistance, and clientelism in the South, all of which are seen to contrast with the image of a widespread self-reliance in the North. Vague aspirations to a European identity can be seen simultaneously as a move away from quote-unquote Africa, as Umberto Bossi commented just after the general election of 1992. And these are Bossi's words. The North has chosen federalism and Europe. The South has chosen fascism and Africa. But on another level, Mignone in his 2008 edition of this book also predicted the development of Italy in 2022, when it came to the role of the North and the South in Italian politics. When dealing with the post-Risorgimento, Mignone noted how the North-South divide was persistently papered over in the late 19th and early 20th century by politicians and intellectuals who resorted to extreme nationalism, such as Enrico Corradini, Filippo Marinetti, and of course, Benito Mussolini, whom Mignone wrote was, quote, a charismatic figure who could handle well the power of words, though did nothing to heal the North-South divide. This recounting of Italian history and the effect of the Southern question on Italian politics, I believe, neatly predicted the development of the current League of Matteo Salvini, where the other of the South has been replaced by the other that are the migrants. In seeking to build a national identity and following, the League now embraces the South in a surge of populist nationalism targeted against actual Africans, as well as people from West Asia and Eastern Europe. And through it all, the South's persistent economic problems of poverty and unemployment are not addressed. When writing about post-war Italy, Mignone is careful to offer a balanced appraisal of its development, but with a clear eye to its problems. For instance, when looking to the post-war governments and the dominance of the Christian Democrats, he wrote, if the DC, the Christian Democrats, can take most of the merit for the miraculous economic recovery of Italy, it also had to take some of the painful responsibility for the ever-widening economic separation between North and South. Mignone accepted that the Casa per il Mezzogiorno was critical in helping to bring basic infrastructure to the South to boost economic recovery. But because of poor planning, persistent poverty, progressive emigration to the countries of Northern Europe, and most especially Northern Italy, were the result. Mignone also tackled the notion that Italy was a failed democracy after the Risorgimento because of its endlessly short-lived governments and the multiplicity of political parties. Mignone simply retorted that, quote, Italy has also had one of the most stable democracies in the West. It was the only country in Europe to be ruled by the same party, the Christian Democrats, for almost 50 years, and did not see change in the political elites during that time. And the parties changed as necessary. The Christian Democrats moved left to work with the Italian socialists. The socialists went from being a workers' party to a party of the radical center. And even the communists let go of its Marxist-Leninism, embraced working with the Catholics, and distanced itself from the Soviet Union, and embraced NATO through the 70s. But Mignone is also clear on the dangers of having one party dominate politics through the post-war era until the fall of the Soviet Union. While it provided stability, he wrote, the extreme longevity and power of many politicians instituted a kind of dictatorship in a very democratic system. A case in point was Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, who served as Prime Minister 7 times and held various other positions. How did politicians like him survive? Mignone explained that, quote, Andreotti belonged to a world of compromise, flexibility, pragmatism, shrewd political maneuverings, and ruthless realpolitik. For instance, in the 1960s, he was the leader of the Christian Democratic right wing, opposing the entrance of the socialists into the government. Then in the mid-70s, he headed the first Italian government supported by the Italian Communist Party. He established his reputation as being pro-NATO, but then began flirting with the Soviet Union before Gorbachev even arrived on the scene. I found this passage particularly appealing because it again showed Mignone's clear connections across various eras of modern Italian history. In this instance, Mignone was outlining the persistence of what scholars have called trasformismo, as the glue that has held together the Italian democratic experiment since unification. Andreotti was in fact the modern-day incarnation of Agostino de Pretis and Giovanni Giolitti, who in the late 19th and early 20th century bridged left and right, brought a stability that Italy sorely needed at the time, though with all the problems of taming the political opposition and limiting reform that such political practice inevitably brings. The dominance of the Christian Democrats and their ally, the Italian Socialist Party, came to an end with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the overthrow of communist governments in Europe. Their effect on Italian politics is of a particular importance to Mignone and to myself, as his conclusions pointed to the contemporary problems Italy is still facing. This, I believe, is another instance of Mignone's accurate depiction of Italian history, as those lessons still hold true a generation later. The Cold War, he wrote, had caused political immobility, even as adversaries, the Christian Democrats and the communists, had reinforced one another. Fear of the communists kept the Christian Democrats in power, and popular dissatisfaction with the government kept the communists strong. There was little room in the middle for smaller parties, which became satellites of the big ones. With the collapse of communism, however, the situation became fluid. The fall of communism may have been the catalyst that precipitated all the distrust that had been developing through the years. In fact, the political earthquake recorded in the election of the spring of '92 was mostly the result of anger at the Christian Democrats-led governments long held in check by fear of communism. And predicting the morass of multi-party politics that defined Italy thereafter and today, he added, "The vacuum created by the collapse of ideologies was filled by a proliferation of special interest and anti-system parties. It had been difficult enough to govern Italy with 12 parties represented in parliament. What would happen," he asked, "with a 20-party representation is unimaginable," as it clearly proved to be. The Northern League and its descendants were born of that election in 1992. And after referenda demanding electoral reform, minimizing proportional representation in favor of majority votes, Berlusconi's Forza Italia, Umberto Bossi's Northern League, and the neo-fascist Movimento Sociale Italiano formed a triumphant right-wing coalition and took power, though not having a common ideological program. It was difficult to read this section of Mignone's book and not consider the recent Italian elections. With the same right-wing coalition, all with different ideological positions, having come to power. The Fratelli d'Italia is the successor of the MSI, though now in the driver's seat of the coalition. Matteo Salvini now heads the League, but Silvio Berlusconi is still there, running Forza Italia, what little of there is left. In another prescient comment, still true today as when it was written back then, Mignone notes, "The success of Berlusconi's Forza Italia in this first parliamentary election to be held under majority electoral system suggests that these new political identities are far from solid. The election showed that while there are voters who strongly identify with a particular political formation, there has been the emergence of a large electorate whose sense of political belonging is not a central, important, and conscious feature of their lives. Public disillusionment with political process, as reflected in falling electoral turnout and party membership, was symptomatic of a decline in strong political attachments and could be observed throughout the Western democracies in this period. For many, politics as a vocation became politics as spectacle. For the great majority, politics is experienced as essentially a passive activity that is almost dependent on media representations of political monologues or interviews between politicians and journalists. How much truer is that today, with declining voter turnout in Italy, the disenchantment of young voters, and the hegemony of Twitter and television in the making of talking points which drive election politicking, often without any basis in rational policymaking. From calls to drastically eliminate taxes or increase spending, and thus driving up the Italian debt contrary to EU regulations and endangering EU financial aid, to reckless and unrealistic claims to close Italy's borders to all migrants. Mignone sought to explain this political disillusion with an analysis of the electoral reform of 1993, which allocated more seats by a majority system. He explained the resulting political fragmentation, instability, and consequent disillusionment of the Italian voter in this fashion because of the change in the electoral system, which to me still rings true today. While many Italians believe the retention of a proportional representation component has led to persistent party fragmentation, the problem appears to originate in the internal agreements reached by coalition partners in order to allocate single-member college nominations. Smaller parties usually demand and secure safe seats as a condition for joining one coalition or the other. Rather than risk losing the election, the larger coalition partners usually bow to these demands, outrageous as they may be sometimes. Consequently, small parties often secure parliamentary representation even when they have failed to reach the basic threshold. As such, he continued, these alliances have been largely geared to win elections first and sort out policy differences among coalition partners later. But usually these differences are too difficult to hold together, and these coalitions constantly fall apart from the inside out. One reads these words, which were applied to the election of the 1990s and 2000s, and is stunned that Mignone's historical analysis still holds true for the political maneuverings of the last few years and recent months in Italy, where you see first the Five-Star Movement and the League form of government, then the Five-Star and the Democratic Party form of government, then Draghi's technical government, which then came apart when the COVID crisis started loosening up. But let me finish with this on a higher note. In all of Mignone's negative commentary about the state of politics in Italy as spettacolo, the multiplicity of political parties, voter disenchantment, and weak governments built on unwieldy coalitions, at root he was confident of the state of Italian democracy. After the travails of the Brigate Rosse and the neo-fascist terrorism of the 1970s and 80s, and then the discovery after 9/11 that Al-Qaeda was being funneled into Europe through its mafia connections, the state reacted with aggressive anti-terrorism measures and to protect Italian democracy. And, Mignone wrote, the state won the battle against domestic terrorism. In more ways than Italians themselves may have anticipated, terrorism brutally tested the proposition that Italy's democracy at bottom is a strong, healthy institution. Because the preservation of a high-level democracy in a pluralistic society may require special security measures, Italians have adapted to a new style of living, whether stoically enduring long lines outside security entrances, state offices, or bank offices. Italians have quickly responded that freedom, whatever the price, has to be preserved. From this position, I would imagine Mignone would have marveled at the immediate and extreme measures adopted by the Italian state at the beginning of the COVID lockdown in an effort to preserve the nation itself. In that crisis, the parties came together and allowed Conte and then later Draghi to rule in a virtual wartime coalition. However, I expect Mignone would not have been surprised that when the crisis began to relent in the spring of 22, this COVID coalition fell apart as the constituent parties sought to trigger elections to improve their relative positions. Mario Mignone was predominantly a literary scholar, but he excelled in explaining modern Italy to his readers in his book, Italy Today. I look forward to the 4th edition, which my colleague will now discuss. And I want to thank the Center for Italian Studies for giving me this opportunity to take one more intellectual journey with Mario Mignone. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ialongo. The next presenter is Nicolino Applauso. Dr. Applauso is the director of the World Languages and International Studies Lab at Morgan State University, where he was also instrumental in the foundation of the Italian program in 2018. His main research is on Dante and medieval literature and politics, satire, and modern Italian history. His recent publications include 2 books, Dante's Comedy and the Ethics of Invective in Medieval Italy, Lexington Press 2019, and Dante Satiro, Satire in Dante Alighieri's Comedy and Other Works, Lexington Press 2020. He is currently finalizing the 4th edition of Italy Today, Changes and Challenges from World War II to the Coronavirus Pandemic, forthcoming in Peter Lang 2023. The title of his presentation is Caro Maestro e Cavaliere Mignone, Cosa scriviamo oggi? Reflections on writing the new edition of the seminal multidisciplinary masterpiece Italy Today, from World War II to the Coronavirus Pandemic.
Thank you so much, Andrea, Fedi. And before I start, I would like also to thank everybody, grazie a tutti, especially Giuseppe Gazzola and Matteo Brera and all the great team here at Stony Brook University for organizing this important memorial to commemorate Mario Mignone. Special thanks also to the family of Mignone that is here, particularly Lois Mignone, with whom I corresponded and also spoke on the phone. It's great to see you in person. And I'm delighted and honored to be here to present what is forthcoming next year. That is the 4th edition of Mario Mignone's book, Italy Today. You can see here a little PowerPoint presentation as we'll try also to go through the history of this project and the title. So this contribution will present the details behind the project of the new edition of Italy Today, co-edited by Mario Mignone and I, that is forthcoming with Peter Lang Publishing, which is the same publisher that published this latest edition. This new edition, as you can see from the title, which changed, and especially after recent development acquired the addition of the coronavirus pandemic, includes turning points and changes. And this 4th edition is still has a multidisciplinary scope, as previously authored by Mignone in 2008, and I have here the copy, as we will go through it together. So in the following presentation, I'm projecting to cover three main points, the time allowed. First point will be Italy Today, Mario Mignone's work, its importance, its impact, and its scope, which I think was groundbreaking when it came out first edition, and is still very seminal and important work for us all. Second part of this presentation, I will address why and how this new edition came about with Mario Mignone, and the planning behind it, maybe some behind the scene. And the last point is about the challenges that the authors are facing this new edition, now that the times are changing, are moving toward different history, and the time goes from picking up what has been done, covering the most recent material that wasn't covered in the original edition, which goes from 2008 to 2022 or 23. I think 23 will be the cap of the, and writing with Mario, which has been going on for quite some time now that I'm involved in finishing this project. I would like to start first talking about what is behind this work as a textbook utilized mainly for teaching history, Italian history. And I have, as you can see, some picture. Teaching Italian history present many challenges and reward. This is because the subject matter and the development of the history of Italy and of the Italian people has been taking so many complex and diverse turns that I will not be completely wrong talk about several entanglements throughout various ages of Italian history. Here you can see some picture of some books, history books. And any author or historian that writes such text, when faces things in Italy, I think this is a great challenge because indeed, unlike other nations, the historical tradition of Italy traces back thousands of years and covers so many political and social changes and social and economical within the century that a reader must get lost or worse, fail to find a united path to walk through this intricacy and long period. Maybe this is the reason that not a great number of textbooks are available. As you can see here, not many are already available. There are many studies about Italian history you can find, but putting those studies in readable textbook delivered for classes and teaching for pedagogical research and pedagogical practice is not too common. There are so few. Now, we do have a good number of studies and research, as I mentioned, but there are these are some of the most well-known examples of text written for teachers to be utilized in the classroom. Paul Ginsburg has been one of the most cited examples. It was published some time ago of an Italian history textbooks. There are others you can see. And they cover different periods. And these are utilized mainly for English-speaking countries, in England, I guess Canada, the United States. Now, you can see the work for Harry Herder with Wally goes from ancient times to modern Italy, and the most recent one here by Anthony Cardoza. And let's take Ginsburg now. While Ginsburg highlights the political development of Italy from its origin to recent years, other examples show different focus on the range of years, which at times is wide and cover a large period, like you see on the right. Now, each historian is always faced with this difficult task: how to present the complex and multifaceted history of Italy, where to place reflections and facts with a cohesive and coherent narrative, when oftentimes history doesn't proceed through a linear path or toward discernible growth, or I would say positivistic or progressive development. Although valuable, these books do not always include too much details about various implications of historical moments and present readers with various challenges. Paul Gibson, for example, as many others, explained the rationale behind this work. And this is a more concise history that you may have used. You can see here what Paul Ginsburg mentions that explain the fact that it is written like a success story, gradually developing from war-torn and poverty-stricken country, regionally and predominantly agrarian, to a successful story of recent years in Italy. It's a success story, like many other books. Oftentimes, this approach seeks to simplify the complex and multifaceted history of Italy by putting into a digestible narrative. As you can see here, from the explanation, is a reaction that is given, especially to other studies, in this case, British historians, that often seem to write of Italy in a slightly condescending manner, not surprisingly. And this example of Harry Herder as well is a way to contrast that. But in doing so, what happens, and this is the main point I'm trying to make, that the book becomes a defense in a way. Maybe there is a little agenda here to promote the Italian history. Now, why is this different from the work of Mignone? Now, the work of Mignone, right when it came out, created a precedent, a very different type of work. You can see the 3 editions here, first one coming out in 1995, that was published 10 years after Mario Mignone founded the Center of Italian Studies in 1985, which established a cultural bridge between the university and the community and created the first endowed chair in Stony Brook in the entire College of Art and Science. Now, you can see here what is the difference, I think, between this seminal work and the predecessor, in a way, other history books and textbooks that are still coming out. There is a strong connection with the student-centered approach. Right at the very beginning, and this is the edition of 1995, there is the students. The students are in the picture. The historian and the teachers are two figures combined. Mario Mignone here is starting right away off the bat, saying, I began to teach my course on modern Italy or give a lecture on the topic. I asked those present to tell me with what they associate Italy and Italian. So the target readers are students, and you can see the approach is open and multifaceted right from the very start. You can also see in these other examples how the work seeks to be very comprehensive, not a linear or perhaps focus on a specific point, like I showed you earlier with Ginsberg politics. Here we have the various phases. The fact that the work doesn't seek solely to approach the political or the social, but many and many different points. Right away, when the book came out, was recognized as a groundbreaking and seminal work. And you can see some of the review that shows that appreciation, a framework that courageously built up the dynamics that gave impetus to the profound transformation. We have other that see the documentation behind it, see the multifaceted and the complex arrays of perspectives of this work. And Mario Mignone, as you can see here, since 2008, has been thinking about writing this new edition. And as you can see here, since 2008, many things have changed. And this edition that I have here was requested not only from the student, but from many other teachers that use this throughout the United States. You can see again the focus on culture, the focus on the various aspects of Italian history, politics, economics, society. As you can see here, not merely in a linear way, but also showing all the contradiction, the complexities. And I may also add anthropological, socio-political, many approaches, economical, as you can see in the book. Attention to great details and objectivity from Mario Mignone, as well as his very clear stance. And the most important point I would like to highlight is the heterogeneity and the changes that occur in Italy that are highlighted. As you can see here, this is from the first pages and the first chapter of the book, the various conflict and complexities. And you see the objective of the author to avoid making the mistakes from many Anglo-American anthropologists, focusing on small communities, perhaps using samples and data to make a larger assumption. Again, Mario Mignone is very careful, documented his approach, holistic yet particular. I will say a first in this type of works for Italian history textbooks. This, I think, as many of his achievements brought him to receive a very great honor from Italy. And you can see here Mario Mignone. And I point this out because the date, as you can see, may be a coincidence, but it's an important date to remember as September the 8th, when he was announced, was also, as you can see, in connection to what I will mention later. Now, the book you can see is a meaty work, 400 pages, but divided in many different parts. You can see here the introduction. If you're not familiar with the textbook, it is a book that may be intimidating at first for this length and the wide variety of topics covered, but it goes to approach the history of Italy in many different ways, many different lenses. That when I first saw it, and I utilized it in my classes, I was not only very impressed, but also wonder if this is a work of one single author. That's the first thing I thought. It is not possible that only one person wrote this, but of course this is the product of many years of Mignone's experience as a scholar and teacher, because he was able to also deliver in a very readable fashion all this material. You can see also the conclusion of each chapter, if you have the chance to read it, that include always conclusion and a general picture of the topic in a very heterogeneous opening thoughts, not closing and labeling, but opening thoughts and steering ideas. That's what I found out while I was using this book in my classes when I was teaching history courses in English at Ialongo University, Maryland. Students appreciated this complexity, and it was important to share this with Mario. And when I had the chance to talk to him in person. Now, since 2008, many things have changed in Italy and the global history, including both social and demographic changes in the Italian population. More specifically, the world experienced the global financial crisis of 2008. And that was one of the main reasons why there was a request for a new edition. In 2008, when this book came out, right in that year, you remember what happened, 2008? You probably remember in your pocket what happened. That to be more light, the recession. So that was one of the, I will say, worst economic disaster after World War II. Nobody knew there was going to be another disaster after that, even worse than the 2008 recession, and that is the pandemic. So many things have changed, mass migration from Africa and the East, as well as the coronavirus pandemic. You can see why a new edition of Italy Today was needed from 2008, right a few years after as today. And you can see some of the points that we include in this new edition that have to do with many changes that Italy has gone through. The mass migration, also the political changes with populism, the surge of the right, and new dynamics that are putting into question democracy as a system. Now, how the idea of the new edition emerged, I would like just to go through with you some behind the scene, because I think this is important to show Mario Mignone as a scholar, but also as a man, as a great human being, I have to say. The idea came about, well, the collaboration, I will say, came about very fortuitously with an email written to Mario Mignone in December 2017, not long ago. I haven't met Mignone yet in person, but I've been using his book. I look up as a junior scholar, very honored to be in touch with Mario Mignone. And it was about just a review for a colleague, University of Roma 3, Franco Sweetener. I was involved in this book, and we're seeking some reviewer, Forum Italicum. And you can see the reply of Mario Mignone, because I couldn't help it to give a little praise, because his book, as you can see, when he replied, I was expecting Mario Mignone to reply. I was putting a PS. The PS was short, and he mentioned simple question to Mario Mignone: what are you doing the new edition? I've been writing a lot of additional material, because it's becoming increasingly difficult when in 2018, 2017, well, back then 2017, to include all the new material. And I just posed the question to Mario Mignone in the email. Mi chiedevo se stesse considerando aggiornare questa importante antologia, Berlusconi, il Movimento 5 Stelle. We were close to the new election. And Mario Mignone answered, of course, to the message about the review. And it was very interesting, his replies. You can see, non ho tempo per altri 2 anni, ma se ti piacerebbe collaborare, ti senti preparato, lo possiamo fare insieme. And we have already, as many of you mentioned, Professor Mignone, but I noticed this exchange become informal with the two right away. I was very delighted. And the exchange continue. I exchanged work that I published with him. I was working on a study on political with the economist Paolo Silos Labini, the Berlusconi government, and also another article with the political satire and music during the years of lead. Mario Mignone was very interested about this work, and as you can see, the collaboration started, and since the election, I was working on the material for my class. I was invited to give a lecture. Mario Mignone invited me to give a lecture on the election. There was some problem with snow. We delayed the invitation, but at the end, I was able to give a lecture on the Italian election. During that meeting that occurred not long ago, this is the PowerPoint of my presentation. It was a great encounter for me, personally, to meet Mario for the first time, and discuss in a way that was very fruitful and very, I will say, open to different perspective. As Mario Mignone taught me, this presentation was open. And I presented populism as I presented in my class, thinking about the student, not bringing to the table an opinion about populism, but asking the question, what is populism? We had a good audience, mainly for the community. This was supposed to be a lecture for a student in a class, but I think that semester some of you were in sabbaticals. But we had a good turnout with the community showing up for this, and I was right at the cultural, the Institute of Italian with Mario. As you can see here from these slides, from the presentation, we talk a little bit about populism, and I address the topic, really discussing the phenomenon that was discussed and brought up right in 2018. Who is against? Who is for? You can see some people that then became prime minister that they were against, and then some people that are for. And the populism was so much as a novelty, but it was always associated with the right wing, as I brought here in my presentation. So this is just to show you the presentation, how we went, and the discussion that developed. Because again, Italy as a laboratory, Umberto Eco, I guess, famously said that, shows always new system, new political views. And the populism in Italy, I don't know where animal it was. It was definitely not a right-wing phenomenon. As you know, we have a very abnormal situation. Again, this created a very interesting discussion. And then was, as I mentioned, a great meeting. We discussed this possibility. And I was worried too. I don't know how this talk will go with Mario. And as some of you mentioned, he didn't say much. And after I share my opinion, I was very interested about the topic. Mario told me his opinion and all the various points. I was very interested to see his opinion, and he agreed with some points. We went over others, but definitely the discussion was very dynamic. And as you can see here, this continued over time on the telephone, the new edition, and the contract was made. Another lesson, another lesson from Mignone that I would like to mention was the fact that I wrote 2 books before this, but I didn't have enough experience to negotiate. And as a Fred de Guadalupe, I don't know if you hear. Oh, there you go. Mario Mignone also taught me to negotiate, the art of negotiation with publisher, because he was able to negotiate, because the book sold well, and he was thinking for this new edition, and the editor was acting a little bit like, I run the show. No, Mario said, I run the show. I make the deal. Mario, again, was instrumental for this. And then I would like to point out something that was very important for me, the discussion on the phone, but also the exchange. And here you can see the date, because this was September the 6th. Many mail came, throughout this period. And I'm pointing this out, the date. Why is the date important? Because, as you know, Mario Mignone passed not long ago after this email that I received from him. If I'm not wrong, it was a Sunday, September the 8th. So from what you see from this correspondence, he was still thinking about this new edition. We were working together to try to finish it. We were working on the details about what to change, what to cut. A lot of discussion about cutting, a lot of material, making shorter, even though I found it difficult sometimes. But then an email came about. This was his last email I received the day before, I think. And the email he sent me some comments from Bonafin that also discussed with Signora Mignone about making this more interactive, perhaps including questions. And this was a very important lesson for me as an author, a lesson in humility, because we write books. We expect everybody to maybe understand and appreciate our books. But oftentimes it's good as a teacher to confer with our reader, the students, our colleagues. And that, I think, is another great lesson that I learned from Mario Mignone. So the changes were made. And as you can see, highlighting here the changes, and the great loss came. I was shattered. But I continue this work as Mario wanted. The focus on being concise and condensed is still being kept as the work continues, student-oriented with a more interactive voice. Each chapter according to some of the comments, include questions and keyword the student can explore. And these are some examples. For example, that was mentioned before in chapter 1. Students talk about how Italians are. Well, we thought about perhaps giving them an exercise that they can try to write physical trait, and then at the end we can have a discussion about it. Even the section about stereotypes on chapter 1. This is for a magazine that tells a little bit what the other European may think about the Mediterranean or Italians, and so on and so forth. And also a current trend, I teach in a historically black college, so it's important also to connect Italy to the history of colonialism. Some sections include the interactive portion when we have a question to student, and bringing also to the table some other recent phenomena like Montanelli, Italo Montanelli, and some of the discussion. And you can see this at the end of the chapter, some question. What do you think the historical moment of colonialism? What is your opinion? And as you can see, more interactive exercise, political government. We provide the picture of the Repubblica. The student have to do a matching exercise, perhaps finding questions on the website. So, and for the partitocrazia, perhaps giving them a list and asking questions, open a forum, a discussion with the student, try to make this as interactive as possible. And this is just to give you an example about the challenge, because keeping the Mario Mignone's voice, Mario Mignone's perspective, this is the conclusion of the first chapter that you all know, and it was just mentioned just before by Ernest Ialongo. My take and our take, it's about a question about Italy, a flawed democracy, or maybe democracy flawed, because there is a crisis going on. And if this term came from England, The Economist, I also mentioned what has been happening in England, that as you can see, I don't know many prime ministers in 5 years that have been changing. So, and the idea that Italy, again, is being a more stable democracy in Europe. So you can see how that continues the spirit of Mario. And to conclude, and also, of course, some contradiction, as we have the longest serving minister within these years of 2008, being Berlusconi, namely, well, the other one. And somehow they were sitting at the table eating, I don't know how that happened. And the forgotten politicians. So you can see the contradiction of Italian history. The superstar or the youngest prime minister in the history of Italy, completely forgotten Renzi, as well as Luigi Di Maio, the superstar of the Movimento 5 Stelle. A question to ask our students, why those superstars, or Mattatore, like he was called, disappeared from the scene. So there's also a new chapter, brand new chapter about Nuovi Italiani, and I collaborated and seek material from other activists and other, and showing the Italian experience, and that's what Mario also, I think, taught us all, not following the usual linear or stereotypical way, because immigration is being connected oftentimes with strife, problems. So the idea is to follow Mario's league and introduce entrepreneurship in the pictures, because that's what immigration is. So these are some entrepreneurs. You can see this line of new Afro-Italian, the great presence of Chinese Italian that are revolutionizing the economy in Italy with the introduction of the dollar store or euro store, and the Prato community. So things that can be interesting for the student to know and discuss in class. And of course, the impact of the coronavirus, which included one of the most rigorous laws ever after fascist Italy for the mandates, but yet made Italy the epicenter of the, maybe exiting the epicenter after being the epicenter of the pandemic. So, and to conclude, sorry I went a little bit over my time, but I would like to say, Mario, last time I heard from him, he said, "Occupantene tu." And it's been a challenge for many, as well as a great challenge, because from one part, trying to preserve Mario's multifaceted, innovative, and heterogeneous perspective. Now I'm the sole author finishing this work, and at the same time reducing, changing, updating this great masterpiece, so the text without distorting the original intent, and keeping as much as possible the hand of Mario. And to conclude, keeping Mario's hand through his strong position that do not merely praise Italy or shine a positive light or depict a linear history, but unveil the complexity and intricacy, the intricate beauty of Italy and the Italian people through rapture, inconsistency, paradox, and its leading uniqueness that made Italy a model for many things. So I've been asking myself this question as I'm reviewing with my little Nell this big hand of a dragon. And the question is, caro Mario, cavaliere e maestro Mignone, cosa scriviamo oggi? I've been saying and asking this question to myself, and I'm also asking this question for you, as we continue to keep alive the legacy of Mario Mignone today. Grazie Mario, e grazie a voi.